Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. And buckle up for this one. This has a lot of big words. I'm definitely going to be stumbling through this, so hang on tight. Dr. Deanna L. Kelly is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Medicine, and affiliate professor in the School of Pharmacy. She is currently the director and chief of the Treatment Research Program at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. Dr. Kelly has led and been involved in numerous clinical trials in schizophrenia and severe mental illness, and has been active in psychopharmacology research for almost 25 years. Dr. Kelly has co-authored and authored 20 books and book chapters, published over 220 peer-reviewed articles, presented over 250 scientific posters, and has given over 175 indicted lectures. That's it. That's all she's done. She has co-authored 4 editions of the book entitled Pharmacologic Treatment of Schizophrenia and authored the schizophrenia chapter for the Pharmacotherapy Principles and Practice. In 2017, she was awarded the prestigious Maltz Prize for innovative and promising schizophrenia research by the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. Her latest book, co-authored with 2 other amazing experts, is called Get Your Brain Off Grain, How a Gluten-Free Diet Could Improve Your Mental and Neurological Health. That went slightly better than I was anticipating. Dr. Deanna Kelly, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Hi, thanks so much for that nice introduction. I'm glad to be here today.
That's all the things you've done, just, the 20 books and the 220 peer-reviewed articles and posters. That's it. That's all you've been up to.
There's a couple other fun things in there we didn't mention, but I'll save that for later.
That's absolutely amazing. Oh my goodness. Okay, so this is going to feel a little bit like a Quentin Tarantino movie because we're going to skip way ahead in your story and things going on. There's been something I've been wanting to ask you about for a long time. Something that kind of came up last year. I believe when I reached out last year, I believe you were in a space where you weren't able to kind of talk about what was going on at that time. Was that the case?
Yeah, it was just a challenging time when my study got shut down right away immediately, and I really just wasn't prepared to be talking about that. Now we can talk about it a little bit more. So yeah.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I was not aware of the study itself. I'm sure most people were not aware of the study itself. We were only aware that a study had been all of a sudden just completely canceled. Of course, our amazing mutual friend, Dr. Chris Palmer, put out a petition to try to petition this study to get put on again, which I checked last night has over 20,000 signatures at the time of this recording. And we just all heard that there was this amazing study. It was going to be done examining diet, in particular, like low carbohydrate or ketogenic diets in the world of schizophrenia. And all of a sudden it goes dark. And we were all just like, well, what just happened? Why? What's the motive? Like, that's the biggest thing I get from people when they hear about it is like, why was this taken down? Is there any explanation given? So again, this is going to be like a Quentin Tarantino movie. We're going to skip ahead in your story before we go back and tell your own personal story. But I've been dying to ask you, what happened? What was the study? How was the study conjured up? How was it going to be presented? And then what happened?
Oh gosh, this last spring was a whirlwind. And so it had been an exciting year leading up to that. We had, been working on our newest clinical trial looking at a ketogenic diet for people who had schizophrenia. It was going to be done in an inpatient setting, which would be the first thing in the United States, in a setting where we could control the food, the exercise, all, the environmental factors. And this would have been one of the most robust studies we would have had. We were excited. We had funding to do this study. We were in a research program working with a state hospital facility where I've been practicing, like you said, well over 25 years. We have performed over 40 clinical trials. We're a very stringent research program. And we, unfortunately, our Secretary of Health in the Department of Health was unfamiliar largely with research being done and people who had severe mental illness, really not understanding the history of that, not understanding all the details around it, and without any issues with our study, decided to shut down all of our research. Now, fortunately, because we had NIH studies, et cetera, happening, there was pressure from NIH. There was a lot of pressure from the community. As you know, 21,000 people signed this petition that Chris Palmer put out. But not only that, but many advocacy groups wrote letters, large advocacy groups. For example, the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance jumped in. There was the Maryland Psychiatric Society wrote letters. Many people who I didn't even know, sort of on my behalf, reached out. They did overturn the decision to allow federally funded studies to occur, but drew the line on non-federally funded studies. And so that left us in a little bit still of a bind, where we have been trying to educate and trying to have people understand like how stringent the studies are, whether they're federally funded or they're funded by private foundations. And in fact, like we have very little funded by NIH anymore in the clinical trial realm, not just in schizophrenia, but in all aspects of psychiatric treatment. So private foundations are really critical to help fund the research initiative in our country. So that's where we're at. We're still not overturned. And I can a little bit more about that. We have a new Secretary of Health that stepped in February of this year. And so I've had some initial conversations, and around that, we have put in an ask to the new administration to overturn that. And so I'm very hopeful that we'll start negotiations to get that overturned, to be able to start the study. We've learned a lot in a year. We've learned even, I always feel like a door closes and another one opens. So I'm hopeful that this will be a new stepping stone for us to even do some additional outcomes in the study that we wouldn't even done the first time. So there's where we're at. We're clear fast forward. I'm not there yet. I'm not crossed the finish line to get restarted again, but we are well prepared to move forward again once we
Wow.
are able. Yeah, yeah.
I love the positivity and the optimism. That must have been so frustrating when that happened. It sounds like a really promising trial. And these are going to be like really honest questions. I don't know much
Sure.
about this, but what does it matter where the funding comes from, whether it comes from NIH, the government, or from public fund? Like what difference does the money itself make?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things here, right? There's perception and then there's the reality. The reality is that it makes no difference either way. We still have to have all of our studies, all of us in the country we're seen by our institutional review boards. These are boards that are outside independent people that manage. We have for our studies data safety monitoring boards, so it's a whole nother study type board that manages. We have hospital research committees we have three governing bodies. That's just the three that alone, but we have, we monitor ourselves, et cetera. And sometimes we have, which the federal government, OHAR, Office of Health and Research Protections, also looks up. So we have many people overseeing our research, and that really doesn't depend on how that's funded. So we have to do the same rigorous processes no matter how we do studies. Now, the perception is to the community, potentially in this case, is that federally funded studies might have more oversight than a private foundation, or there might be more influence. Now, many private foundations have no influence themselves on the science. So they're not influencing the outcome, or it's not a pharmaceutical company saying, if you do this and we'll do this, or, it's still very independent science. We write the protocols, we write the grants. So the perception, I think, was there that there is potentially differences in the scrutiny and the oversight, when in fact, there's in many times just as much oversight in both, whether it's federally funded or not. So that's how I would describe it, giving the benefit of the doubt to why someone might wonder, what the
Yeah,
difference
and
is.
by and large, like these boards and this oversight, I mean, you might have complaints about certain rules or certain things you can and can't do, but by and large, this makes sure that we do studies that are ethical. A bunch of studies that we've done in the past could never pass some of those boards today. It's lucky that, Dr. George Cahill, for example, did the fasting studies where they fasted people and then dosed them with insulin after like 40 days. You could never get away with doing that today, but we do have that data. It's nice. But by and large, these standards are really good to make sure we're not doing things that are unethical or really sketchy.
No, these are really good safeguards in place. And in fact, I'm a treatment researcher. So everything that we do, I want to show benefit to people we're treating today. So we're not doing experimental studies where there's outcomes where we're not sure what's going to happen. In fact, in the studies that we have, and even in the keto diet, for example, I wrote it such that every person would get benefit for some aspect of the study. So the study was written so that it was it was a single blind study. So the patients themselves knew what they were taking. The people rating them on their psychiatric symptoms didn't know what they were taking. So everyone sort of knew what they were taking. So it was safe. We knew what they were getting. And then it was 5 weeks of treatment, but either the keto diet or the regular diet. But after the 5 weeks, for 8 weeks, people could have opted to go on a keto diet. free of charge, with good oversight, with good help and helping them get started, with good understanding, like how do you actually do this, so that if they were, when they're discharged, they could go out in the community and do it. So everybody had an opportunity, and it's really difficult, sometimes to implement that on your own. Here's the chance in the hospital setting for people to help them do it, where everybody would get some type of benefit in the study.
Wow. Well,
Yeah.
I'm glad you reiterated that point, and I want to reiterate that again. When you're saying you've got people impatient and you're controlling the food, somebody might think, well, what's the big deal? Like, isn't that how all food studies are done? Can you contrast that with what like a normal, food study might collect their data? Why that's so different?
You mean being in the inpatient setting? So yeah, in the inpatient setting, we have a dietitian here on staff, and the dietitian is trained in how to do ketogenic diet, so that our dietary menus are all designed with people in mind for being here in the hospital, for what they might like. We ask them at the beginning if they have preferences. If they don't have preferences, we are catering to make it as easy as possible. So this is not just like a stringent where this is absolutely what you're going to do and you don't have any choice. There's lots of choice in this matter. We're just helping them get into ketosis in a very structured way. And so it's a nice setup for people to be able to participate, and it gave them something additional to try. In addition to that, we didn't stop any medications. There was no changes in medications. This was an adjunct. So it allowed people to stay on the treatment that they're getting, but also be able to try a dietary intervention as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just you think about that, and again, I don't know that most people really consider this, but when you see headlines that come out that say red meat, is associated with cancer or whatever it is, they're basing their assumptions based on, say, a food frequency questionnaire. How many times in the last year have you had apple in parentheses one? Have you had it once a month, twice a month, once a week, twice? Like, they're terrible. You can't really assert any data, yet they draw these conclusions from those studies. Like, actually fee, or another example would be like, well, we gave these people education about the ketogenic diet. We gave this other group of people education about a standard American diet, and they just went off and ate themselves. Well, you don't know what they're actually doing in their day-to-day life. They may be
Oh,
following your advice,
it,
might be different yesterday to today. Today they may be keto. Tomorrow it might be tacos and pizza. Like, you have no idea. So to
right.
have that level of control it's such a huge step.
It's a huge step, Casey, because as you said, you send people home, and as you and I both, and anybody listening out there, how hard it is to actually, to adhere completely to something. And so here we have the opportunity to help people, like, oh, I'm thinking I don't want to be in the diet. Okay, well, you don't have to be in the study, but we have a snack for you. We have a snack for you. You don't have to go make a snack. We have everything set up for you to make it as stringent as possible. And so we don't miss anything. We make sure that everybody eats everything on their plate. And if they don't eat everything on their plate, for a keto diet, we have to, change up the next day just to make sure the ratios are the same, so that we make sure that there's no room for extra confounds into this study. That it's really anything that we're looking at is because of the dietary changes, and that's pretty powerful for science. Because if we run a large clinical trial in the outpatient setting and people mess that up and we don't have an effect, and we say, well, we spent $3 million of taxpayers' money and we just don't know if we did a good job. That's not fair to anyone. So we're being the most efficient we can be, having the most stringent study in an inpatient setting that you can get out there. And the world was awaiting our results because there were no inpatient studies. So, I hope that we can deliver on that, and that's my hope that we can do
Oh
that.
my goodness. Yeah, I hope so too. And on that note, like, since I become a nutrition coach, many years ago, I used to write a lot of meal plans. I hardly ever do now, because I can tell you, for the hundreds of meal plans I've carefully spent tons of time on and written, I can tell you the compliance percentage of somebody on a meal plan is exactly 0%. Like, nobody, nobody
Right,
does.
right, right, right.
Yeah.
But here we
Well,
had it. Here we have a well done study. So
yeah.
yeah.
Sounds amazing. And then with the cancellation, again, what was a reason provided? Was a new criteria laid out? You missed this part. We need to clean this up. Anything along those lines given, as far as like, here's why? Nothing.
Zero. There were zero
Crickets.
human subjects protections, concerns, or any concerns with how we conduct business. Absolutely zero. And I can say that with 100% accuracy. We were actually given that note that said there are no concerns about how the conduct of the study is. We just are thinking about a new rule about federally funded versus non-federally funded studies. And I just think that, like I said, that perception's there. If we do education and try to get over that, I think that having federally funded and non-federally funded studies as an opportunity here in Maryland will be hopefully important for everyone to move forward on that in the future. But zero human subjects concerned with our study at all.
Okay, well,
I
you
know
don't
it's a
have to.
lot. It's mind blowing, but
It really is.
it's a year later, and I'm trying to find the path forward because the science is so important, and it's really important to answer this question. So I'm gonna figure it out, and we're gonna get it done.
You're amazing. You're the best. You don't have to comment on this. I would understand 100% if you don't. I'll just leave this here. Like what I'm thinking. What the people in this community are thinking. When we see that this work is about to be done, it gets canceled out of nowhere. Those of us who have been in the metabolic psychiatry realm for a while understand, like, when you're trying diet up against medication for some of these things, like, it's not perfect, but it's not even close. Like, it's such a vast delta for the results that you can get on this stuff, and to us it looks pretty nefarious. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have good optics as far as what we can see. So again, I understand if you don't want to comment on that, but that must be a sentiment that is
Yeah, and I think
communicated to you.
I agree that it did not have good optics, and I think that's why it went so viral. I think, within, there was a lot of press, there were a lot of people contacting me to communicate. Everyone's trying to figure out, there's a lot of speculation on what this might mean. And like you said, even if you read, we do have the results from that online survey, the 21,000 people that signed the change.org. We were able to get those, even though I didn't start it, we were able to get that information back to us, and we could actually read all 1,100 comments that were in there. And you're right, a lot of people said, I have had benefit on a keto diet. My patients have, my sister has, my brother have, I have. It's amazing. 37 countries represented across the globe. People said amazing things, but there were lots of comments that said it's very interesting that, why is a dietary study being stopped and not a pharmaceutical study when in fact it could be very safe. And so there were hundreds and hundreds, if you look at the data, of people that actually, looked at the optics that way. I can't speculate on why. I mean, I can speculate, but I really have no information to sort of share on that about why the pharmaceutical study, the medication study could proceed when the other one couldn't, other than it was federally funded versus non-federally funded. But you're right, the optics are there. We need to be really as a field, we need to make sure that we are giving opportunities to our patients that are for medications and for alternative treatments that might be effective both. And I started off as I'm a pharmacist. My background is in pharmacy. Medications and pharmacology is my wheelhouse. That's where I started. And for me to be in this space, looking at dietary interventions, it's because the science took us there and the treatment outcomes take us there. I'm more concerned about what to do about our patients and how to give best treatment and best care. This study is one of those things that I'm just very excited to keep moving forward.
Well, amazing. I can't wait for it to come out. I'm sure the tides will turn. And like you mentioned earlier in the conversation, a door closes, another one opens. A few months ago, I've mentioned this before on the show, Nicole Laurent told me how you can put into Google Scholar a keyword, so ketogenic, and all the studies that have to do with ketogenic come to my email. And it is like drinking from a fire hose. It's insane. It's like every other day, I've got another email. Like, I don't have time to comb through all these. And to think, like, you're doing amazing work. That study could have come out something like that. Like, maybe hardly anybody knew about it. And now, at least with the controversy, everybody's got eyeballs on it, and we're going to be very fascinated with the results. And so that may be the big opportunity here, is by closing this down. Not only will people watch this space a lot more closely and watch this study, but maybe could get interested even more in this stuff. So I think overall it would be positive. I'm really hoping that you are able to conduct it.
Absolutely. We're a group in Maryland that's well known for doing clinical trials and doing them really, really well. So I have a strong team here. We have a strong team of people. We have a strong research support community and advocacy community in Maryland. I just think that everything is ripe for being able to move forward. And so we will.
Awesome. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. Like I said, I've been dying to ask you about that study ever since we saw that. So thank you very much. Let's go back to the beginning. Tell us how you got interested in becoming a psychiatrist, and especially, with the PharmD background, the medications and the interventions that we have for serious mental disorders like schizophrenia.
Yeah, Casey, I started off going to pharmacy school. So my undergrad was in a bachelor's in pharmacy, got my doctorate, and I really wanted to go into psychiatry, and I wasn't sure how to do that with my pharmacy degree. But then I realized there is a specialty in psych called psychiatric pharmacy practice, where I was able to do a residency, and so I did that at the University of Maryland. But during my residency, I fell in love with research and clinical care. I was at a state hospital where I'm located now, like on these same grounds right outside here. And I asked for one day just to go shadow at the research center, and I fell in love. And we talk about fast forward. It's now 27 years later. I'm now director of that same research program that I snuck in as a student just to see a few things one day, way back in the late 1990s. I mean,
That's
no,
cool.
I
That's
date
cool.
myself, but just a story of like, of a passion and how much I really enjoyed what I was doing. I ended up at the University of Maryland as a junior faculty, and then started writing grants and worked within a unit. My office was on a hospital unit where I got to see patients every day. So, we talk about people being ivory towers. I was far from an ivory tower. I was in the trenches. We were in like in a state hospital facility. So I saw people with severe mental illness every day, and I still see them every single day. And so I design the work and the studies and the passion that really fuels us based on how can we get someone better? What can we do better? And so I've been passionate with a medication we call clozapine, which has been superior for treatment of schizophrenia, but also now more recently, understanding why certain people have inflammatory signatures or immune reactions, and why is that case? Why is that the case? And what can we do to particularly treat that subgroup of people? Like personalized treatment. We're looking at gluten-free diets. We can talk about that in a subset of people. We're looking at different supplements that might be helpful to certain people with inflammation, et cetera, as well. So I've really been working my career to help people where they are today and help move the needle on best practices for care of people with psychotic disorders.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. It's so cool that you ended up in the same spot at
Yeah.
the end of all of that.
Yeah.
So being in this space for a really, really long time, massive technological advances. To think that how far the internet has come, iPhones, smartphones, social media, like all these things that have evolved, and the technology that's gotten so much better in so many facets of life. It's just such an interesting contrast to the medical industry. And sure, like technology is helping, things move along, we're getting better at things. With, in your career, what have you observed as far as medications for some of these things? And again, such a long time frame, practicing what you're practicing. What was it like, using medications in the beginning, and how did that progress over the course of your career? We're miles covered essentially in like the improvement.
Yeah, no, I started my career right when all of what we call the second generation antipsychotics, they were the new antipsychotics were coming onto the market. And, this was the late 1990s. Most of these medications were just coming out. And the unfortunate thing is that we believed, I mean, I think it was part of all of our faults with the pharmaceutical company, all of our faults, but we started to believe that these new medications out were the next best thing, that they were going to be better than anything else we had. And we jumped on it right away. Now they offer a lot of benefits in terms of side effects. But we've come to learn after doing many clinical trials later, it's not just me, but many others in the field, that the medications that came out aren't necessarily all that more efficacious than the original ones we had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They offer some benefits, and certainly less side effects. So we'd want to use them in the majority of cases, but they haven't got to the underlying underlying pathophysiology. They're treating symptoms, and sometimes just 20% better, 30% at most better. Are we getting patients? We're not sort of getting to the root cause. And there's not a lot of new medications on the horizon that look like they're going to be significantly better than what we had before. Now, there's one medication, clozapine, that I work with. It's for treatment-resistant schizophrenia. I find it to be the most impactful, and I've really spent a lot of time trying to get that medication in better use, and have worked, had testified it for Congress. I testified at the FDA in November, and we've recently got rid of some of the federal regulations around how you can use it, so people have more opportunity to use it. But at the end of the day, we don't see anything that's as efficacious as that. It has several side effects with it, and unfortunately, it being in the field for almost 30 years, we've had a lot of medication advances and a lot of new medications, but we're still looking for something that's going to maybe get at the root cause and help people get into remission at much higher rates than we do now.
Yeah, it's so
Yeah, yeah.
interesting, and like the efficaciousness of a drug, like being, like 30% is like the very best case scenario. Like that's great. That's a good improvement. We talk about, that's not going to be everybody, and most people are not going to get to that level. But 30% is pretty good. I don't think we talk enough about the side effects. What are some of the side effects that you commonly notice with people that are taking some of these medications? Again, they might only give you a marginal advantage, and then on the back end, what other things do people have to deal with as far as side effects go typically?
Yeah, no, a lot of the earlier antipsychotics, and I've studied a lot in the space and published a lot in the area, but like a lot of metabolic dysfunction. So people that are already at risk for maybe having high glucose and high cholesterol levels, now we put them in additional risk. So there's been higher rates of metabolic syndrome, higher rates of obesity, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and people with schizophrenia die 15 years earlier than the general population. I mean, this is
Wow.
high mortality rates, take away life years, et cetera. So metabolic side effects. Some of the older medications had more stiffness and movement disorders associated with them. You might have thought of the old Thorazine shuffle that people might have heard about. We don't see that as much. And some of the newer medications that are on the market have very, very low weight gain. So that is exciting that we have changed the field a little bit. But some of the medications have GI side effects associated with them. Some of them have excess salivation associated with them. We do, with clozapine, we have a risk of myocarditis that's small, et cetera. And we have prolactin side effects, sexual dysfunction, lack of menstrual periods. So all the antipsychotics do have some side effects associated with them. And often we have to give another medication to offset the side effect associated with them. But yeah.
Were you ever very frustrated in your career that more progress wasn't made?
You know, I I am an optimist, as you said. I'm always looking. I see like everything that we've done of moving us forward somewhere. But I am disappointed that we haven't had more progress. And I thought that the medication clozapine, we would find another medication like clozapine with some of the side effects. I am thankful we have that medication. I'm thankful we've been able to get it out to more people with the recent changes. I've spent a lot of my career trying to get that better used, and it's only used in about 4% of people in the United States. So it is hard to get some evidence-based treatments even out there to be used sometimes, and there's lots of barriers to why the uptake is lower than it is. But I am disappointed that we have not had a breakthrough medication that could have that was clozapine like, or it had even done better than clozapine over my career. So, but
Gotcha.
yeah.
Take us
And that's
back
why I've
to
turned to looking at other types of treatments that might get to underlying causes. So we can
right.
come back to that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. So take us to the part in your career where you just had started to learn that this could also be a food thing. There were other ways that you could deal with this. It must have felt amazing. I believe, if I have your story right, it was something along the lines of the gut brain kind of axis and the way the two of those work together. But like, yeah, what was that like to take on some of that work and realize like, wow, this is also something that can be used that maybe could be more effective?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that got me into the space was looking at inflammation. So we started to look at inflammatory markers in the periphery, like drawing blood and looking at those, and seeing that a lot of people have very, very high inflammation. There's all kinds of literature out there that a lot of mental health conditions, even cardiovascular disease and other things, as you know, associated with high inflammation. But it was confusing because there's so many inflammatory markers. The way we measure it is not ideal, et cetera. And so it's hard to understand the underlying pathophysiology of why someone has inflammation. So I started to look at different people who had inflammation, and I started to discover that there was a subgroup of people with schizophrenia in particular who had an immune reaction to the protein in and wheat, barley, rye gluten, or gliadin, which is a component of it. And we're having an immune reaction to that, high antibodies in the blood. And those people were the ones that I was noting that had high inflammation. And so we did a study looking at brain inflammation and saw that a measure of neuroimaging that proxied brain inflammation looked like in this subgroup, it was also high. So I'm thinking, well, I have this group of people who have high inflammation, which might explain why there's mixed data out there. This group seems to be very inflamed, but they're also having an immune reaction to gluten. And so that's interesting. I looked back in the field, then I started to understand, you know what, there is literature that showed us that during, before Westernization and some of these small islands, that there was very low rates of mental health conditions until some of these dietary changes came in. We also had seen like during times of low wheat use. And so then I thought, what's happening with these immune markers, and why is this group different? And that sort of led down the path of starting into using inflammation and subgrouping, but it really just started me on a trajectory where I started to understand then, gosh, what we put into our gut can actually change our brain. It's we could talk more about the gluten story, because I think it's specific, to subgroups of people with celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Not every single person, but certainly things like ketogenic diet or different supplements we have tried that modulate either gut bacteria or modulate communication between the gut and the brain can have profound effects on treatment outcomes.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yes, I do want to dive into the gluten story. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Timing wise, when you were doing this research, had the books, we have certain books about these things like Grain Brain and Wheat Belly, and, your Dr. Perlmutter's out there. The other author is escaping me right now, but he's written about it. William Davis. So like, what was there starting to be awareness around gluten being problematic when you were first coming and doing your own research?
When I first started, it was challenging because, it still is always challenging when you're looking at alternative treatments for the field to sort of accept things. And that's why I'll come back to like that's sort of why we wrote the book. But at the time that I was starting, I was trying to get NIH funding, and you can only imagine how challenging that was. But you know what? It went through review. We had reviewers who thought that there was merit to the story, looked at the science of like how we did this pilot work that we did, what we were showing. We were showing people's symptomatology get better in really stringent designs, et cetera. So surprisingly, NIH had given us some pilot funding to look at this. I remember the program officer said to me, "Well, if Deanna, I'm surprised this has been funded. You were persistent," and I'm like, I'm going to get this funded because the science is there. And so that it was challenging to get funding, challenging to people to accept the fact that this is different than pharmacologic treatments, et cetera. But there are books and there is information out there. But what is sort of lacking is this really well put together communal body where we can look at how psychiatric symptoms are really impacted by gluten. What do we know in the literature? We can put that story together, because I have families, I have clinicians from all over the country that are monthly emailing me saying, you know what, that my child, my patient, their psychiatric symptoms might be related to gluten based on different clues and based on what I'm thinking, but I really can't find a resource to go together to help me understand if that could be true. And so we wanted to be a really factual, evidence-based conglomeration of like what's out there, not only my research, but what else is out there. Well, we ended up with 400 some pages. That's because there's a lot of evidence in there. It's a little sciencey, and you picked up on it's a little sciencey. And so we really tried to make it a lay reader's understanding, but people have to put on their seatbelts a little bit to like try to understand. And we try to walk them through the science on that, because I don't want people at the end of the day to still put it down and say, this could be just a fad diet. And that's my concern with previous books that were amazing. But even when I was writing and talking to experts in the field and seeing if they would like endorse the book or read the book, and people were saying, well, the previous, everything that's been out there previously has been a little bit more controversial. And so I just really wanted to make sure we grounded it in evidence, because there's a lot of it.
Yeah. Okay. I cannot wait to read it. I'm sure it's amazingly done. And again, another honest question. I'm not sure if you have a lot of the history down in the book or are very familiar with that, but the biggest pushback I get with a lot of people, when I say like probably bread, probably gluten, not the best idea to be consuming a lot of, especially with certain people. The pushback I get is, well, we've been consuming bread. We've been doing agriculture for 10,000 years. Like, what happened? Did we always have schizophrenia as we were eating bread? Or like, what happened historically to get us to where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, we get this question all the time, and we do address it a tad bit in the book, and we don't know the answers exactly. There's lots of different thoughts on this, but certainly, certainly, I mean, as you mentioned, wheat's only been in our diet for 6 to 10,000 years. So we were hunters, we were gatherers, we were more in ketosis. We come back to that later than we are in now in our Western society. But we're eating meat, fruits, vegetables, and that's primarily what we're eating. And like I said, some of the early studies in the 1920s and 30s, actually, when you go look at them, these epidemiologic studies, Curtis Dohan, a famous gentleman, he's no longer here, but his grandchildren still carry on his love for this, his passion for this. But he found, like I said, he went into these countries, found little mental health conditions, went in after Westernization and do find higher rates of mental health conditions. So we do have some evidence there, but it also is potentially in the way ultra processed food has really come through. We ultra processed food in different ways than we did, or food is processed in different ways, and wheat is processed in different ways than we had previously. The temperatures that it's like that the food is made from, etc. So there's potentially the way we manufacture and in ultra processed ways that has contributed to that. But I don't know all the reasons why. But we also, our microbiome plays a role in this too, and our microbiomes are ever evolving with the way that with the foods that we eat. So our diets and what we've been putting in has also probably contributed to the way we react to foods, et cetera. And I can also talk about mimicry. There's an idea that gluten, and some of our data shows that some of the breakdown of the gliadin fragments itself have it look like some of the receptors in the brain. And so now that we start to understand that as well, we can maybe understand that these things might be connected more than we ever thought they were. But celiac disease itself, even if I'm talking about celiac and non-celiac gluten sensitivity or just bread in general, but celiac disease itself is associated with a lot of symptoms, not just the gut. So I think we thought that celiac was a gut disease for years and years. So I think that's another reason, is now we understand that celiac disease could manifest on the skin, can manifest in other organs or in the brain. And I think that's why we missed a lot of those cases too. So there's a variety of reasons. I don't know the real answer, but we sure know that, we know that there's a connection now, and we know that this crosstalk between the brain and the gut is a real thing.
Got it. Okay. And again, this is probably pure speculation as well. But could we also say like the method of us eating wheat has changed drastically, where we were, naturally fermenting using sourdough kind of a thing, and or that the wheat itself is changed? Again, those ideas kind of brought forth by Grain Brain and that
Yep.
kind of thing is like
I
we're dealing with a different monster than we would have evolved with,
Yeah, and I
for
was
the
just
last
trying to
six
give
months.
several examples of different things. We don't know the exact reason, but I think all of those, especially what you mentioned too, are all reasons why this is true. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And I'm glad you guys started your book out in the way that you did. What by like defining some of these things. It reminds me, if I were to go ask somebody on the street what type 2 diabetes is, they would maybe tell me something about insulin, maybe about blood sugar, maybe about glucose, but they probably wouldn't know the difference between all those things. And I think it's kind of similar in this realm where we talk about gluten, we talk about celiacs, we talk about non-celiac sensitivity. There's sensitivities and there's intolerances. There's all these different things, all this mumbo jumbo. So can you help us kind of clarify how we classify some of these things and how we determine whether somebody just has a bit of a sensitivity or they have something a more severe reaction to gluten and other substances?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So the way we laid the book out is to try to be very educational so that we have and no assumptions about what people understand and what they don't. So I sort of think of it in there's three parts to the book. The beginning chapters are like, what is gluten? What does it look like? Why is it important in our diet? How does it cause an immune reaction? How does it cross into the brain? The reaction to gluten cross into the brain. And then we also spell out what is celiac disease itself, and that's an autoimmune disorder that causes damage to the gut villi, et cetera. And what is non-celiac gluten sensitivity? It's a sensitivity to gluten where celiac disease is not the culprit. You don't have antibodies to something called tissue transglutaminate. You're not attacking the gut, but you're actually having an immune response to gluten. How do you figure that out? And both of them are treated with a gluten-free diet. And non-celiac gluten sensitivity is probably 10 to 17% of the population. So people just really don't understand that. So anyway, we lay that out at the beginning. And then I feel like the chapters in the middle are sort of choose your own adventure kind of book, because it's the evidence base for ADHD, autism, schizophrenia, depression, neurologic disorders like seizures and migraines. So if people have a sense of someone that they know or themselves that might that suffer from some of these mental health conditions or neurologic conditions, they could sort of read that chapter, take a look at it. But we designed the chapters to be in the middle, to be very user friendly too. So for example, with depression, it would say, what is depression? How is depression usually treated? And what are the typical symptoms? And then what is the linkage? Like what is all the evidence of gluten and depression? And what has been done to look at gluten-free diets to treat depression? So then we could talk about that. And then we always end each chapter in the middle with case reports, like a couple, maybe anywhere from 2 to 10 of literature-based case reports, not our case reports, but where people could identify and say, oh my gosh, that looks like me. It's someone who's in and out of the hospital with some rash and some fogginess, brain fogginess, et cetera, for years and years. And finally, we got tested for, celiac disease, or finally I tried a gluten-free diet and I had relief. And so what we figured out, I was non-celiac gluten sensitive. So it helps people in the middle to kind of pick and choose. In the end of the book, we also just then look at like, how do you get started on a gluten-free diet? How do you identify labels for people that have never done this or want additional, pointers, et cetera. We have a chapter on recipe, 2-week recipe planner, et cetera, in the back of the book as well. So that's sort of like the 3 parts. But yeah, we wanted to lay it out so people understood, put it in lay terms at the beginning. So as you build upon it, you could understand, like, what are they talking about? Why is gluten important? What is gluten? And what does it do to the brain? So yeah.
Gotcha. And is it similar to other fields in metabolic psychiatry where it could be genetics, the way that different people manifest certain things? Like, why does one person have depression? Why does somebody else have anxiety? Why does somebody else get schizophrenia? Does it even matter that we're different genetically? Is that kind of like irrelevant? That you're going to have some people are going to have some type of manifestation of this, and whether you want to, call it one thing or another, it's the brain reacting to the substance unfavorably.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So celiac disease itself has a known genetic component to it. There's some evidence that non-celiac gluten sensitivity does. So people would have a response. One would think that, and we do know this runs in families. So if parents and children are sensitive and they feel much better on a gluten-free diet, their brain fog clears up, their anxiety sort of clears up, et cetera, then we typically see that run in families as well. We don't really know a lot about the genetics of that, but I certainly believe that there's a lot of genetic component to a lot of these disorders, especially known for celiac disease as well. So yeah.
Got it. Okay. And yeah, I'd be guilty of thinking of celiac disease as more like a gut disease until I learned some of this stuff. But tell us about the mechanism of how gluten is acting in the brain, how it's causing damage, the way that people probably don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, we think there's a couple of things that we think. And so we wrote it. We have a nice figure, I think, in chapter 4 or chapter 5 that we recreated. So gliadin itself, which is a protein from gluten, is a stimulant, is a very powerful stimulant of the tight junctions, these of the gut lining. So there's all these cells, like endothelial cells, that line the gut lining. And so they stick together. And so we write in the book, if you get this far, we write, there's the game Red Rover, won't you come over? If you remember that game, and you run across, you try to break through the arms. And we actually use it because it's a good example. So when you break through the arms, you're sort of breaking, if you think of that with the gut lining, you break into the gut and things get through. The gut is supposed to keep things out, like you digest through your gut, you absorb the nutrients you need, but foreign invaders like bacteria or foreign invaders to the body, which gluten can get through. And so gliadin itself can stimulate those tight junctions to open up and secrete something. There's something called zonulin, which is a tight junction regulator. It was discovered by Dr. Felicio Fasano maybe 15, 20 years ago. And he was at University of Maryland. I'd met him at the time. That's where I learned some of my initial work from him, but opens them up. It can get through. So gluten can get through, and then the body creates antibodies against it. They see it as a foreign substance that's not supposed to be getting through, creates what we call antibodies, and wants to fight like sort of the quote infection, or fight the antigen, which is the foreign substance, gluten, from coming through. When it does that, it releases a cascade of inflammatory markers, mediators, B cells, T cells. Our whole body's immune sort of response. If there's the genetic component there for celiac disease, then you can attack your own gut lining, and then you start to, your own body attacks itself, and that's what happens in that case. But in other people who have just an immune reaction and not celiac, it can get out in the bloodstream. These little molecules can travel, and they can cross. We understand it so far they can cross into the brain like they cross the gut. So there's a study from Johns Hopkins, Bob Yolkin, Emily Severance. They looked at antibodies to gliadin in the blood and in the cerebral spinal fluid. And in fact, they should not be crossing in an intact, cerebral spinal fluid and brain barrier. They should not be crossing, but in fact they do. And it shows a tight correlation between the number in the body and the number in the brain, showing they're getting through somehow to the brain. So we think that gluten comes in, stimulates opening of the junctions, gets into the bloodstream, creates a whole cascade of an immune response. And you can imagine when this gets sent to the brain, inflammation in the brain if you think about it, generally, it's just a bad thing to have inflammation in the brain. And we actually, in our last study, it's not in the book, but in our last study, we looked at brain imaging, and we looked at blood flow in the brain changes with a gluten-free diet, and we looked at the linkage of psychiatric symptoms to brain inflammation. And we can see, and so we have really nice pictures of this, but we can show that that symptoms are linked to blood flow in the brain, and you can change this by taking away gluten. So it's really fascinating that we can actually show now some of these brain changes with gluten. But that's how we think that it happens. Casey, the other thing I mentioned was this mimicry idea. So the one fragment of gluten looks a lot like the NMDA receptor in the brain. And so the NMDA is just one of our neurotransmitter systems in the brain that helps cells communicate to each other. But one of the fragments of that receptor, the glutamate receptor, looks like gluten. So if you do a proteins analysis or structure of how they're structured, they look really similar. So the body could see gluten and then go back and attack its own sort of brain cells because of this mimicry, this idea of mimicry. That's in its infancy. We have one paper on this. We're looking at getting more grants in this area, but there is that idea that gluten could be a mimicker of another area of the brain. That might be why we actually might have some higher inflammation in the brain as well. But those are a couple of theories that we think are going on with the brain. But certainly celiac and non-celiac gluten sensitivity are both, and a lot of people, like I mentioned, don't know they have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It's really hard there's not a biomarker for it. There's a huge amount of the population who do really well on a gluten-free diet and feel a lot better once they remove it from the brain. Yeah.
That is absolutely fascinating. And yeah, I haven't read the whole book. I've read part of chapter 1. And you mentioned the diagrams and the pictures you have in the book. And I have to say, those diagrams are so helpful and very, very well done. I'm really glad you included that. I think it's really nice to be able to look at. So that part of it looks great. Let's talk about some of that practicality. Like you said, like helping people understand what they need to do. It makes me grateful that I'm carnivore, and it's just one more thing that I can just skip right over and not have to think about it all. But for other people, this is really challenging. Once you start to identify gluten, you realize gluten is not just a loaf of bread. Like gluten is everywhere. It's everywhere. It's hard to get away from. So how do you help people start? And then also, how do you help people maintain a gluten-free diet?
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to know that, eating fresh fruits and fresh vegetables, eating meat, eating natural foods actually allow us to, eat gluten-free and eat, like when we're on keto or we're in carnivore, we're often are in a gluten-free state. So because we're not, obviously not putting high amounts of bread into our bodies. So people think that, oh gosh, I can't eat bread. I'm going to have to do a substitute for that. And it's not always great. And these are sometimes higher in sugar. So the gluten substitutes are not always the best. So I think finding alternative, better, healthier eating in general is a better way to go. But there are gluten-free products out there everywhere. There's a lot of good tasting ones, more so than in past years, that the breads are better, et cetera. But I think it's important like you said, for people to know it's not just eating bread. So we try to go through and talk about, well, obviously anything wheat-based, there's pastas, it's cereals, et cetera, things like that. But then they're thickeners. They're in things like like some of the gravies that you buy, some of the soups that you buy. You'll see wheat listed on the back. So you have to pay attention. We have a whole chapter showing about what's certified gluten-free mean, and how do you look at the label for that, and how do you know then that something is gluten-free or not. So we go through that. We worked with many of the celiac societies to make sure that we have the proper labeling that they all sanction in the book. And so we got the official little monographs or the little logos from most of the company or most of the governing bodies in the book, so people could see that. But people recognize like the check mark gluten-free, but all countries have different, some of the different symbols, and it's important to look for that.
I'm glad you brought up the labeling. That was something I was going to ask you about. It kind of reminds me of like how we have like 70 different names for sugar, how you can find and identify sugar, and it's a huge list. Is it you're just looking for a few? Does it seem easier trying to identify gluten than it is to identify sugar in different products?
Not necessarily, because there's different, different terminology like cellulose, like those other things that might have wheat base or filler in it, and they don't actually say wheat itself. So like you have to look for the you have to look for the label. You have to we give a list in there of different terminologies and words that might contain gluten. But you mentioned like chapstick can cause gluten, or can contain gluten, makeup can contain gluten, etc. And so, we have to pay attention to that. Now, in celiac disease, since it's autoimmune based, and a lot of people are misdiagnosed because they don't, like I said, they think of it's just a gut, they don't know that it might be manifesting in different ways. But even just a tad bit of gluten is going to be you're going to have an autoimmune reaction to it. So people that have celiac disease, it's not a fad diet, it's nothing like that. Like it's their life or death. It's autoimmune. People with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, what we have found, what we understand is that people potentially could, after healing the gut, there's leaky gut that happens. People have been able to introduce little bits back in. Some people can, and some people can never do that. But that allows you potentially to try that again once you've been healthy for a while, et cetera, to see if you can tolerate a little bit of gluten. But celiac disease, you can't do that. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Good segue, because I was going to ask you, like, in your, this is very general, in your experience, in your observation, when somebody identifies this as a problem, they step away from gluten, like, sure, it is hard to maintain some of these, more restrictive diets. I agree with you. I don't think it's a fad. But in your experience, for somebody to maintain the diet, again, bringing up like different motivations, like if you're dealing with a serious disease, of course you're going to be more motivated and your diet's going to be more strict. But are people in general kind of surprised that, like, when they started, they never thought they could go without bread, and after a while, does it just get a lot easier, and do people miss certain foods a lot less than they assumed they would in the beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really when people do well, I think that's a powerful motivator. And I think that happens. You see that in the keto field. You'll see that in the work we do with keto. When people feel so good, they don't want to go back to feeling bad. They haven't felt this good. The same is true for some people on gluten-free diets. So one of my authors, Jessica Hellings, she's one of the authors in the book. She approached me 5 years ago and knew that I was doing research in the area, and she's a psychiatrist who came and said, you know what, I didn't know that I was sensitive to gluten. I had panic disorder and anxiety. And once I went on a gluten-free diet, she describes it, and she writes a chapter in the book where she describes it, but she immediately felt like 20 years younger. She immediately had much higher energy, and she is now not having panic attacks and anxiety. And so she was a firsthand. And so someone, when you have something like that happen and you think, oh my gosh, I've never felt better, in my life, I feel so much better. I'm going to do everything I can to sort of stick with it. And she describes it to me when she did this is, I just used rice cakes. I just skipped the bread and just went to rice cakes, and like, I'm good with that. Now, for some people, it is a little bit more challenging. But a lot of people, do miss bread, but everything else sort of they can get, get around. But they, once people know that they feel better, there's a lot of alternatives now. There's a lot of other things that we can eat, and people do, like, a lot of people that are doing well. And even people, like, people say someone with schizophrenia, someone with depression, someone with cognitive impairments or anything, they're not going to be able to do a diet like this. Well, you know what? We have a lot of people, because people care about them, their self. People advocate for themselves. Their family members advocate when they see when they find a difference in their mental health and they feel better. It's not, we teach people, like, where do you shop? How do you shop? Where do you go in the grocery store? How do you do this on a budget? Because it's expensive. What are some recipes that you can use where you didn't realize that there's so much you can eat without having, gluten in it. Like think about dinner. You can eat potatoes, you can eat rice, you can eat meat, you can eat vegetables. You don't need to have bread on the side at dinner time. And so that's the biggest thing, is just sort of giving up the bread. But people do really well. Yeah.
Yeah, I just met part of a family in Canada virtually. It was a mother and her daughter. Her daughter's 13, suffers with bipolar, completely reversed her bipolar on metabolic therapies, ketogenic diets. Incredible story. And you talk to this little girl, and she's just so bright and smart and energetic and polite and kind, and was just sitting there like eating pieces of steak. And I asked her, like, is this fair to you that you have to eat this certain way, and you look around and you see these kids and they can celebrate and have parties and all this stuff? Like, does it feel unfair to you that you have to eat this certain way and other people don't have to eat this certain way? She didn't even hesitate. I didn't even hardly finish the question. She's like, no, that's just poison. I don't want that in my body. Like, if a 13-year-old can recognize it and do it, I think all of us could realize, like, once you get past that suffering, like, you don't ever want to go back there. You hear the stories all the time of, like, I'm doing keto, but I'm going to this wedding, I'm going to have the cake. And not only did I feel terrible for 2 days, but the cake didn't even like taste good. Like, it was like
Right.
objectively gross anyway.
I know. We have this bias. We have this bias that's like, and in fact, this is like this. I've done surveys in psychiatry for lots of things. And a lot of times the number one reason why the barrier to using something or doing something is because the patient won't do this. That's usually, or like they won't do this. And in fact, you got to give people the choice. It's about shared decision making. It's about talking and saying, hey, look, there's alternative things that we can do. This might be hard. You might find it to work, or you might find it not to work. But giving people the chance and not selling it short early on are really important. And and that leads into a little bit with the work that we're doing with in keto diet. We've recently been funded to look at what we're calling live it, launch it. And it's my idea that it's more important, like as practitioners, for us to sort of understand how to do a keto diet. How do we, if we know how to do it ourselves and we have experience with it, then it's going to be much easier for us to be able to help our patients and people in the community institute that. If someone calls me on a Friday and says, I just ate an Oreo, because people are going to slip up, right? That girl eating the meat, she's going to do her best, but she's going to slip up here and there. Like, how do we help them? And so, like, if we have understand what it feels like ourselves, how much better we feel, what our labs look like what like brain wise and body wise, we're going to be motivated to sell it to people. We're going to be, better off in helping them understand, like, how do you do the intricacies of that, and, really move it from, not just telling them how to do it, but saying, I did it. I know how to do this. It's not that hard. Like, I want you to try it too. So, yeah.
I'm glad you updated us on your current work and upcoming stuff. I think that's wonderful. And one of the things I love the most about your work is that not only is it very scientific, and you're doing the work and finding out answers and generating more questions that we don't have answers to just yet, which is fine, but also that other piece. Like, if all of these studies are ending up in an email in my inbox every few days with all these titles and things I've got to read through, like, it's going to get missed. Like, people are not going to see that on the 9 p.m. news. It's not going to get reported on, and they're going to miss it. And even if they find it, they're not going to know how to do it. So having the piece of, sharing with people how to do this, the examples, leading by example, I think is wonderful. And it's just something I really respect about you and your work.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We're looking forward to it. We're going to be advertising as soon the IRB is in the final stages. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll be in Maryland, the state of Maryland, hopefully opening this up to clinicians around our state. So yeah.
That's amazing. Like I said earlier, I just love your positivity and optimism. And yeah, I can't think of anything more frustrating than to, I don't know, start down a path, generating a study. It takes so much work, so much time to have it just pulled under the rug, like just the rug right out under you, excuse me. Like, it's just so frustrating, but to be able to, like, again, take it as an opportunity, know that there's a lot more people in your corner, people you'd never heard of, came to your support. It's really encouraging for me to hear that there are other organizations other than, Metabolic Mind, people I had not heard of that are out there, maybe feeling like they're in their own little silo. The more of us that come together and kind of research this together, I think is really, really going to be supportive. And I really wish you the best. I hope that study comes out. And just like most people in the space of metabolic psychiatry, we kind of know how it might come out. I think it's going to be really good, but we'll wait and see till we get the data. But for now, Deanna Kelly, this has been an amazing conversation. Where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work?
So I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on X, and I'm on Instagram. So it's Dr.Deanna.Kelly on Instagram, at Prof Deanna K on X, and then they can look up Deanna L. Kelly PharmDBCCP on LinkedIn. And yeah, follow me. Well, we post often some of our work, our papers, and research opportunities.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then the book, where can people find the book? Get the Brain Off Grain?
Get it on Amazon. So look it up. Get your brain off green. It's on, I think it's $29.99, and come in and you can get it on Prime and get it in a few days, I think. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
Perfect. We will link to all of that in the show notes. Like I said, this has been an amazing conversation. I really love your work and really respect it. And you guys are doing some awesome things out there and getting it to people in a way that can be very, very helpful. So thank you so very much for all of your amazing work. And thank you for taking time out of your very busy life to hang out with us today on our show. We really appreciate you.
Casey, it was a pleasure. I'm so glad you invited me. Thanks so much.
It was such an honor to chat with you. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.